Hey everybody, new office, and yeah, things are still a little scattered, but it's a busy month. I'm gonna talk to you guys about overpopulation. In my most recent update video, I announced that I'm having a kid in January, and most of you have been absolutely wonderful. The outpouring of support has been truly inspiring. I did get a few comments, though, that had concerns about my choices in life, and the decision to have a kid was apparently a evil and selfish one, because there's almost 8 billion people on this planet. We're overpopulated as it is, and adding another human to the mix is just irresponsible. There's resource depletion, there's climate change, and all those things. I decided to make this month's video a response to that claim. We're going to talk about overpopulation. People have been proposing on and off for centuries that the problems of the world have to do with there just being far too many people. Again, they blame resource depletion, climate change, increased poverty, political instability, all sorts of things. And the prediction is always at some point we're going to overwhelm the carrying capacity of the planet or the country, and it'll cause absolute suffering, chaos, and everything will fall apart.
Fire and brimstone coming down from the skies, rivers and seas boiling.
40 years of darkness, earthquakes, volcanoes, the dead rising from the grave.
Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
And so, as somebody who's about to have a kid and contributing to the population of the planet, it's a very small way, this is a question that, is on my mind and obviously on the minds of several commenters. But it turns out that when you look at things and you do the research and stuff like that, that the overpopulation of the world being the argument for why all these bad things are happening, or that it's the cause of all these bad things, is not the slam dunk diagnosis that you'd think it is. It's not only incorrect, but it has some troubling assumptions behind it. And the solutions to this non-existent problem have some very pernicious and dark overtones. And at the end of the day, focusing on overpopulation as an issue is sort of a smokescreen for the real problems that we're facing. So today we're going to look at the claims of people who say that our planet is overpopulated, why they're wrong, and what things we actually can do to address the multiple resource and ecological crises we're facing right now. Just to show how far back complaining about there being too many people are, the first overpopulation argument for the problems of the world is a anonymous writing from some very grumpy person in the 2nd century CE in the city of Carthage. But I think most of you would be familiar with Thomas Malthus, who was an economist in Britain in the 18th century. His main argument was that populations are increasing at an exponential rate, but that the food supply is increasing at a linear rate. Now, if you know anything about graphs and such, when the population hits the ceiling of the food, there's going to be issues of mass starvation and tons of death. And so what really needs to happen is some form of control over how many people are being born to flatten the curve, if you will. Otherwise, there's going to be a period of mass starvation and a lot of instability and danger. And Malthus was a reasonably popular writer. He had some detractors, but his policies were very popular, and we'll get into those in a second. A more recent popular argument for overpopulation came in a 1968 book called The Population Bomb. This book by Stanford University professor Paul Ehrlich was a huge bestseller. And most people who talk about overpopulation today are typically inspired by The Population Bomb. In the book, he predicted a lot of the same Malthusian arguments, but then included a bunch of new stuff that had to do with resource depletion and things like water and all that kind of stuff. Specifically, the main argument was that the population that the Earth could handle was one that could be comfortably taken care of with only renewable resources. And according to his analysis and his numbers, if we didn't take care of that, we would hit a wall sometime in the 1970s. And once we hit that, hundreds of millions of people would end up starving. There is, of course, a revised edition that was released in the 1970s that predicted that this would happen in the 1980s. So why did that not happen? Why did the Malthusian disaster not happen? Why did the population bomb never explode? Well, the big one that comes out is technology. The typical Malthusian argument is about the intersection of the population against the food supply. But as we have progressed more into an industrialized society, which, Malthus was at the very beginning of, so there's no blaming him for not predicting this part, but the food supply would grow exponentially. Or at least it would grow enough that we have never had any real issues with the food supply compared to the population. We came close, but then Norman Borlaug actually did a huge agricultural revolution that changed a lot. And so, ever since the population bomb specifically, the amount of hunger in the world has actually been going down, even with the population increasing. So is overpopulation a problem? Not really. We've never seen in the historical record a society collapse due to overpopulation. And if you look at the links between famines, periods of there not being enough food, and the actual food supply, there's not really much of a link at all. Because here's the thing, the Earth is really big. Every human being could live comfortably in a space the size of Texas. And our food supply is in no danger of hitting its limit. With just the grain that we grow alone, we could feed a population of 12 billion people. And the other assumption of the Malthusian argument is that the human population is increasing exponentially. And it is not. In fact, it seems that the human population is actually slowing down to the point that by sometime between 2060 and 2100, we're probably going to peak at somewhere between 10 and 12 billion people, and then the population is going to start going down. By 2060, 2/3 of the human population are going to live in countries that have a birth rate below replacement level, which means that unless they have a mass amount of immigration, their populations are going to decrease. And then sometime in the 22nd century, it's predicted that the population will stabilize at somewhere between 8 to 9 billion people. The main drivers being an increase in women's rights, access to education, and easier access to birth control. On top of that, the human race in general is on a path to greater and greater urbanization, which is good for resource purposes because people who live in cities have a lower resource cost per capita amount. And furthermore, there's enough water on Earth for pretty much every human pretty comfortably. But I'm not some sort of ecological catastrophe denialist. We are in the middle of one of the biggest mass extinctions in the planet's history. We live in the Anthropocene. We have fundamentally changed the nature of this planet, and we are causing economic catastrophes the like we can't even comprehend. So, with everything I just said, what's my excuse, Mr. Smarty Pants? Well, let's get into that. The main problem is not overpopulation, but overconsumption. That grain that could feed 12 billion people, i.e. about as much as, our population's expected to peak out at, is not feeding everybody because half of it gets used to grow livestock. We're also doing a lot of deforestation and invasion into natural spaces in order to create more farmland for more livestock. Furthermore, our fresh water is being abused by agricultural concerns and the desires of rich people. There are a lot of places where we are wasting tons of fresh water. I mean, Nestle alone is bottling huge amounts of Canada's natural freshwater resources, and we're just letting them do it. And when talking about climate change, overpopulation is also still not the problem. The people who are producing CO2 are not the people in countries with high birth rates. The wealthiest 20% of the human population produce like 80% of the world's CO2 emissions. The richest 7% produce half, and the poorest half of the world's population, the part with the highest birth rates, produce 7% of our global CO2 emissions. 7! So if it's not a problem, then why are people making this argument? What is so earwormy about the idea of overpopulation being the source of all of our problems? Well, it's about to get a little dark. The real solutions we're going to have to use to confront climate change and resource depletion have to do with attacking the ideology of endless growth, i.e., we're talking about capitalism again. We're currently using resources we don't need to give to people because The resources we currently have are not being distributed equally. We cling to extremely inefficient agricultural practices where we waste tons of precious water and just pure calories to feed animals to turn them into less efficient food that is more environmentally destructive. Or some of the food we grow is just turned into fuel. And this isn't even factoring into the discussion about how so much food just goes bad, like a quarter of food goes bad. And there are a lot of agricultural practices like supply management and such like that, which help preserve small farms, but at the same time also basically pay farmers to grow food and then toss it out. The United States has an entire cheese cave of unsold cheese. It's not a strategic supply, it's just so that cheese farmers can have a market and keep their things profitable even when nobody is going to be fed from the product. And it's all in a roundabout way to try to control prices without intervening in the free market. So yeah, capitalism is the problem, not overpopulation. Quelle surprise. And the powerful, in order to avoid having the conversation about capitalism, are scapegoating the smallest contributors to our resource depletion instead of, pointing the finger in the right direction. And the problem of scapegoating overpopulation is that it leads us to some very dark places. Because if you look at anybody seriously talking about overpopulation, it's not too long before you're essentially talking about xenophobia and anti-immigration. When right-wing Hindu nationalists talk about overpopulation in India, it's not so much a talk about resource depletion as it is a concern that Muslims specifically have a higher birth rate than Hindus. And in white majority countries, overpopulation talks have a tinge of anti-immigration, xenophobic aspects to them. This can range from everything from harsh border measures all the way to white supremacist white genocide theories. And at the end of the day, it all comes from a very old colonial type thinking about barbarians at the gates. And if that's not bad enough, overpopulation talk tends to get very fashy. Because if you've set up overpopulation as a problem, what are the things you propose to solve it? As soon as we start having the conversations about overpopulation, we start talking about who has the right to reproduce and who has the right to our resources. And a lot of the plans to curb the population of these groups involve forced sterilization. Oftentimes, this means not only attacks on people of color, but attacks on the elderly, on people who have disabilities, or on people who, for some reason or another, use public welfare systems. And all of a sudden, we're doing eugenics. And if you remember Malthus, who I talked about earlier, his proposed solution was to not only make people have to be financially secure enough, rich, to have children, but at the same time proposed essentially removing any and all things to help the poor. Because doing anything to help the less fortunate was encouraging them to reproduce even more. And all of a sudden, our talk about environmentalism has become eco-fascism. So at the end of the day, the main point to take away from this is that we shouldn't let the wealthy elites distract us by blaming each other for the problems of the world when there is a class of people who are responsible for this, and they're the ones with all the power to change things. And if it wouldn't be too hard, maybe we can just get people to really grok that there's a fundamental incompatibility between capitalism and sustainability. And to distract us from having that conversation, the rich are tapping into some of our worst impulses. So just remember, we're all in this together, and I hope that we can stay focused on the true threat to our continued existence on Earth. And believe me, it's not children in West Africa.